Okay, so we'll begin. So yesterday we started just with a brief introduction to the concepts of market failures, looking at externalities in public goods. We're going to consider today in more detail is the whole concept of externalities, the impact they have on market outcomes, and how they might be corrected. So we'll consider a competitive market in which firms produce some product, it doesn't really matter what it is. We'll just consider it to be paper, and the byproducts of the production process, say air and water pollution, so emissions and effluent that harm people who live near the paper mills, but it could be any product that creates a negative externality. So a firm's private cost includes the direct cost of production. So these are the cost of raw materials, the cost of labour, the cost of capital, the cost of plant and machinery, the direct cost of production. These are basically the costs that go in to the firm's accounts. What is in the set of accounts that determines the firm's profit. But there are also then the indirect costs of the harm from pollution. And these don't have an accounting cost or an accounting element. They're not included in the firm's measure of profit. So the total cost of making the good is clearly the cost of the resources the firm uses. If the firm uses raw materials, it pays for them. If the firm uses labour, it pays for it. If the firm uses capital, it pays for it. So it pays prices, wages and interest. Those factors of production could be used elsewhere. The raw materials could be used to make something else. The labour could work in a different setting. The capital could be invested in a different firm, a different industry. But because the firm pays the cost of them, society is in a sense measuring the cost against the benefits. If these resources are scarce, the paper firm will have to pay more for them. So the paper firm will have to be able to generate a product that people want to buy. So it'll have to cover its cost of production so that the price is greater. And the only way the price can be greater is if people want to buy the product the firm is making. So from a societal or social perspective, the costs and benefits will be matched up. The problem with an externality is that there are costs that the firm doesn't take into account. So it takes into account the raw materials, labour and capital cost, but not necessarily the social or external cost. So this could be the cost of the pollution, the cost of the environmental destruction, the cost of the damage, etc. It could be cost in terms of health, in terms of illnesses, disease, quality of life, etc. So in this instance, the cost of making the product might not be balanced with what people are willing to pay for it. People see the price when they buy it, and they assume that reflects the cost of making it. But it only reflects the costs that are private, the cost that the firm actually incurs. These are the costs the firms want to cover, so they will set a price above that. If consumers don't want the product, well, the firm will just stop making that product, and the resources will go somewhere else. But if the cost is different, well, this price-cost calculation may not reflect the true social cost. So in the competitive equilibrium, the firms only consider their private cost when making decisions and ignore the harms that the pollution creates. So we have the demand curve. This reflects basically the benefits. How much are people willing to pay for the product? So clearly the price people are willing to pay reflects the utility or benefit they get from it. So at low units, the price people are willing to pay is quite high, but as people use more and more of the product, the price they're willing to pay declines. So we get a downward sloping demand curve that essentially reflects declining marginal utility. It reflects marginal benefit. And then we have the firm supply curve, which essentially is MPC, the marginal private cost. How much does it cost the firm to supply each unit of the product? So that's reflected by the MPC, that's the supply curve. So using first-year economics, the market equilibrium is just where the supply and demand curve cross, where the marginal benefit curve of consumers crosses the marginal cost curve of producers. And that's given by the point EC. So you get price PC and quantity QC. So that is the competitive equilibrium. And there are many instances in where the competitive equilibrium maximizes social welfare, i.e. it makes the benefit as large as possible. But in this instance, the cost to society isn't necessarily just the MPC. This reflects the factors of production used. So clearly we want the factors of production used in the most efficient manner. We exist in a world of scarcity. Scarce raw materials, scarce labour, scarce capital. So in the competitive equilibrium, you can see that the cost of using the raw materials exactly matches the benefit. So here is the cost going up to quantity QC, and here is the benefit. So the area above the supply curve, the marginal private cost curve, and below the demand curve reflects the benefit created to society. So here's the benefit consumers are getting from using the product, and here's the cost firms are incurring from making it. The distribution of that is determined by the price. The lower the price, the more of this goes to consumers. The higher the price, the more of it goes to firms. But the area will be maximised or optimised. The problem with an externality is that this cost curve here doesn't reflect the true social cost. So MSC is the true social cost. So if there were no externalities, the competitive equilibrium would maximise welfare. However, because of the pollution, the competitive equilibrium does not maximise welfare, because it doesn't take the full range of costs into account. So what is the full range of costs? Well, this is the cost of the factors of production. And then we have the marginal external cost, the MEC. This is the cost of the externality. So if we're taking a simple example, such as a paper mill, this is the cost of the pollution. Damage to air quality, damage to water quality, environmental damage, increased incidence of particular illnesses, respiratory problems, fish kills, a whole host of things which might result from the production of this product, which when you look at the firm's accounts don't appear. So when the firm is making the product, they're looking at the money that's leaving their office. How much do we have to pay for labour, raw materials and capital? They're looking at the money that's coming in terms of prices. What revenue are we generating? And they try to maximise the gap between those two. But from a social or society's perspective, there may be an additional cost. So this gives us the MSC, the marginal social cost of making the product. So this better reflects the true cost of production. It reflects the costs that appear in the firm's accounts and the cost that society incurs. So if we look at what happens at quantity QC, what benefit does society get from the QC unit? When this unit is produced, the benefit is given by the demand curve. So the benefit is at this position here. What point are we on the marginal benefit or demand curve? How much does it cost society to make that unit? Well, that's given up here on the marginal social cost curve. So for the QC unit, the cost exceeds the benefit. Society loses because that unit is produced. There's more costs incurred than there is benefit created. There is an overall net gain from the production of that unit there, simply because the marginal benefit is below the marginal cost. So by going out to QC, society is losing. The firm doesn't necessarily view it that way. The firm is just looking at the costs it's incurring. But for society, there is overproduction. So at the competitive equilibrium, consumer surplus is given by the area A, B, C, D, and producer surplus is given by F, G, and H. So this is the benefits the users of the product get, and this is the profit essentially the firm makes. So this is, in a sense, a surplus for consumers, measured by the excess of utility over the price they pay. And this is a surplus for producers, measured by an excess of revenue over the cost they incur. So producer surplus is essentially profits. But if we look at the competitive equilibrium, Once we go beyond this position here, we're incurring additional costs. So there's an extra cost from going beyond here, because all this cost is not being picked up by the firm. So this area here, G, C, D, E, H, is essentially the cost of the externality. How much pollution is produced. So it's all this sort of triangle, the difference between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost. So this is in a sense a loss through the externality, or the cost of the externality. So this cancels out some of the surpluses. So area C is cancelled out. It's a gain for consumers, but there's also a cost. Area D is cancelled out. Area E isn't appear, G and H. So welfare at the competitive equilibrium is A, B, F minus E. So that is the benefit society gets from this market if it's allowed to operate under a free competitive equilibrium. So area E is the deadweight loss, because the social costs exceed the value that consumers place on the output. So if you look at area E, this is out in the region where the cost to society exceeds the benefit. So this is the whole problem of overproduction. So the marginal social cost curve intersects the demand curve at the socially optimum quantity. So where can we maximize welfare? Well, the maximizing welfare is where the demand curve crosses the true cost curve. So at this position here, this is the area that maximizes welfare. So we see that this is at a lower level of production. What occurs at this point here? Well, the benefit consumers get is exactly equal to the costs of making the product. The marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. So using the equimarginal principle, welfare is maximized at that point there. But there's no incentive for the firm to produce at that point there. If the firm produces at this point here, it actually is losing out on some profit. It could earn additional profit by increasing consumption, or production, out to area QC. So this is the competitive equilibrium, and this is the socially optimum equilibrium. The competitive equilibrium has a deadweight loss, too much production. The socially optimum equilibrium has a smaller quantity, and in fact also has a higher price. But there's no compulsion for the firm to produce at that level. So welfare is maximized when price equals marginal social cost, rather than when price equals marginal private cost. So at the socially optimal equilibrium, consumer surplus is area A. They're using a lower quantity and paying a higher price. Producer surplus is B, C, F, and G. And the externality cost has been reduced to C and G. So welfare at the socially optimal level is A, B, and F. So at the competitive equilibrium, it's A, B, F, minus E. At the socially optimal equilibrium, it's just A, B, and F. So clearly this level of welfare is greater than this level of welfare, because the same positive elements, and the negative element here is eliminated here. So the externality imposes a cost on society. There is a deadweight loss. So this is why we refer to the market as being inefficient. There is a market failure. Welfare is not maximized. So looking at the sort of analysis, the two main things that appear is one, if left to the free market forces, a competitive market produces excessive negative externalities. So if the market is left untethered, unfettered, unregulated, there is excessive production. The second point, and one perhaps that gets overlooked from time to time, is that the optimal amount of pollution is greater than zero. So it's not about eliminating pollution. It's about finding the level of pollution that maximizes welfare. So pollution clearly incurs some cost on society, but the pollution also confers benefits. the product that is made as a result of it. So it's not the case of setting production to zero and eliminating pollution. So it's a matter of weighing up the costs and benefits. Car travel is a simple example. Car travel has huge costs. In Ireland, between 250 and 280 people every year are killed as a result of cars. Yet very few people are known who come out and say you should ban cars, because the benefits they confer on the rest of the population are huge. It's a matter of balancing up one versus the other. So there are huge, painful and excruciating costs, but then there also are benefits. So taking it to a sort of a more scientific approach with pollution, the pollution also has costs. Clearly there are costs in terms of environmental damage, but it does offer benefits. So the issue is a matter of finding the balance between the two. So as the price of pollution to the firms is zero, an unregulated competitive market produces more pollution than is socially optimal, because the marginal cost of pollution to the firm is zero. If the marginal cost of doing something is zero, you'll do it as long as the benefit is positive. So with pollution in an unregulated market, the marginal cost of the firm is zero. It doesn't appear in their accounts. So as long as they're earning a small bit of extra profit from each unit produced, they will continue to produce. The problem is that the marginal cost of pollution to society isn't zero. So society would prefer if production was scaled back, but for the firms it's about profit maximizing. However, even though pollution is harmful, we cannot wipe it out without eliminating virtually all production and consumption. So if we're going to use paper, there is going to be some pollution. If we're going to use electricity, there is going to be some pollution, whether it's from nuclear, which is a relatively clean process, to the carbon created by using fossil fuels. So there are benefits. The issue is, where can we find the balancing act? So how do we solve it? If the unregulated market produces too much, we know there's perhaps some social optimum out there. How do we solve the externality problem? So they can be solved by community cooperation. People realizing that, look, there are costs incurred here, that we'd all be better off if it was looked at in a collective manner. But that generally only would happen in small, close-knit communities where there is a large degree of cooperation. At higher levels, larger areas, larger populations, perhaps communities that aren't as close-knit, we need government rules that require people to behave in ways that mitigates their effects on others. So we basically want to internalize the cost. So the dangers to others, say, of drivers can be reduced if rules of the road, speed limits and drink driving laws are enforced. The key element with any law is the enforcement. It's easy to put in a law. If it isn't enforced, it's of no great significance. So one topical area in relation to laws and their enforcement has to do with the whole structural deficit debate about the fiscal compact. The fact that countries have to run a structural deficit of no more than 0.5% of GDP, or if they have low debt, of no more than 1% of GDP. And this is getting a lot of attention now, but it actually was introduced in 2005. It's been around for 7 years. So as a law, it's existed, but it was never enforced. So it didn't really mean anything. So with driving, you can have rules of the road, speed limits, and drink driving laws. If they're not enforced, they mean nothing. So it's the enforcement that matters more than the introduction. With pollution, the consequence can be reduced with bans, say, on leaded fuels. So 10, 15 years ago, most cars would have run on what was called normal or standard petrol at the time, leaded petrol, which was producing and emitting lead into the atmosphere, and lead to us is poisonous. But throughout the 1990s, there was moves to unleaded fuel. In fact, I can imagine the only petrol you can get in Ireland now is unleaded. That most of the cars which ran on leaded fuel have been scrapped, and any of those which are still in existence will have been converted to to run to leaded fuel. You can also have emission standards. So the leaded fuel focuses on the user, the emission standards focuses on the producer. But if you're going to make a car, how much fuel or how much emissions can come out the exhaust pipe? And cars are huge producers of emissions. You go to fill a tank, you might be putting, I don't know, maybe 50 or 55 litres of fuel into it. Where does it go? 3 days later, you fill it up again. So there's a huge amount of liquid poured into cars. Some of it is clearly converted into energy. It makes the car go forward. But a huge proportion of it comes out the exhaust pipe. Clearly it comes out in a gas form. It is, through the process, it's burnt and heated, and it's converted from liquid to gas. But the same weight virtually comes out. 55 litres of fuel is about 50 kilos. Petrol is slightly lighter than water. So you drive up and down from Cork to Dublin, say do it 4 times, you've emitted in emissions a normal sized body weight, 100 kilos. That's probably a reasonably sized, big man, very big woman. But 100 kilos just by driving up to Dublin 2 times in a week. So the stuff has to come out somewhere. So one way to address this is by emission standards. How much does a car actually produce? So in Europe, these would be quite a serious issue, and there are fairly significant emission standards on the amount that can be produced. So they'll generally be in terms of kilos per kilometre or kilos per units of fuel put in. In the US, it's not such a significant issue. California has tried to introduce emission standards, but they've largely been rebuffed in their attempts, primarily because of the scope and power of the major auto manufacturers over in Michigan, who don't want to satisfy these emission standards. The size and engine size of cars between the US and Europe are dramatically different. In Europe, an engine or a car with an engine of 2.5 or 3 litre would be considered very, very big. Standard size would perhaps be a 1.4 or 1.6 litre car. Vast majority of cars will be at that level. That would be less than half the size of engines in the US. So they have much greater fuel consumption and clearly much greater emissions. So imposing standards on cars of that size will be much more difficult. So you can look at what the consumers are using or what the producers are doing. You can also increase the cost of driving with taxes. So if there's cost of driving, try to internalize it. If something is free, people will overuse it. So we place taxes on cars. So in Ireland we have VRT, which makes up close to 20 or in some cases 25% of the purchase price of a new car. And then we also have substantial excise duties on fuel. The price of petrol is heading for 160. But if there was no tax, the price of petrol would be about 60 cents a litre. About €1 of the price of petrol is tax. So this would be if driving is going to incur costs, and it does. In order to get people to weigh up the costs and benefits, you can try to increase the costs, and you can do that through taxes. One we mentioned yesterday was the whole concept of congestion. The fact that if everybody uses the road at the same time, the value of the road is reduced. Instead of becoming a place where people can move from A to B, it becomes a car park. And roads generally aren't built for the purposes of being car parks. So back in 1963, Nobel Prize winner William Vickery proposed a plan for pricing urban car travel. And while we might be comfortable with technology now, back in 1963 they hardly had the concept of computers. So he looked at traffic congestion in urban areas. So he basically wrote a science fiction piece and said that roadside receptors would scan each car that passed, sending data to a central computer, which would calculate the congestion charge and bill the driver. So 40, 50 years later, this is actually what happens in some urban areas. But roadside receptors were a thing of the future, computers were largely a thing of the future, and centrally billing of drivers, and the whole concept of congestion charges. It is used in some areas. So London, as we referred to yesterday, has a congestion charge. The problem with the London fee is that it's a flat charge. It's the same cost regardless of how busy the road is. What Vickery suggested is that the fee would be larger when congestion was greater and zero when there was none. So if the road was empty, you're imposing no cost on anybody else. So why should you pay? So if the road is empty, you drive through it and there is no cost. If the road is extremely busy and you are adding to that congestion, the price you pay is larger because you're slowing down other people. You are generating and creating an externality. So the London flat charge goes some way to adopting the principles of Vickery, but in fact Singapore is perhaps the best version of Vickery's congestion charge. So if properly priced, the externality from congestion disappears. So the argument is the price should not be to raise government revenue, which is a claim about the London charge, and it's just a tax on people and hasn't really eased congestion, but to make people pay the true cost of driving. So it can be extremely difficult, and taxes set at the wrong level may make matters worse. If you set the tax level too low, people are still using the road, there still is congestion, and you're charging them money for being in congested roads. So that just becomes a revenue raising exercise. If the charge is too low, if it doesn't actually address the congestion in the first place. And then perhaps you have even worse outcome if the tax is too high. You stop people using the road who should be using it. So you have the resource there, but if the tax is too high, people won't use it. So this can sometimes happen in Ireland with tolled motorways. A town can be bypassed and a toll placed on the motorway. But if the toll is set too high, road users might still use the old route, still go through the congested town, still slow up and clog up the town, and have the new, spanking new motorway unused. So this can be a problem on particular occasions. Locally, this would have happened with Watergrass Hill, particularly at the time the full road was built. When Watergrass Hill was originally bypassed, the dual carriageway, the motorway, finished just after the village. So you drove past Glanmire, drove past Watergrass Hill, and the motorway ended. The next stage hadn't been built. The next stage was to build it from Watergrass Hill to Fermoy, and that took place over a number of years. But when the Watergrass Hill to Fermoy stage was built, it was tolled. So when the road was built, to use that section of the motorway, we were tolled. So for a car, it was maybe at the start, I think 170, 180. But for large trucks, it could have been upwards of a fiver. But the issue was when the redesigned road was built, the actual exit from Watergrass Hill was at the far side, the Cork side. So when traffic was coming from Fermoy, it still had to go through Watergrass Hill to get out beyond the toll. So what happened with Watergrass Hill? It went from a position where it was completely bypassed and all the traffic was using the new motorway to a position where it was bypassed, but traffic using the motorway had to pay a toll. And what happened with a lot of heavy goods vehicles was that it was going to save maybe 10, 15 minutes to use the toll, and it wasn't worth a fiver to them. So when the new road, the toll road, was opened, all the heavy goods vehicles went back onto the old route, and now we're actually diverted through Watergrass Hill again. So what happened then over subsequent years is that there now is sort of an internal bypass of Watergrass Hill. And if you come up to it from Fermoy, the road actually veers to the left, and you have to turn right to go into the village. When the bypass was originally built, that wasn't there. You had to drive straight through the village to get out onto the motorway on the far side. So now you can go across, you cross over the motorway without a slip road, and you get onto the exit or the entrance to the motorway at the far side. So the problem was that the road was built, but the cost was set too high for some users who decided to use the old route instead. So the new motorway wasn't fully utilised. So setting the charge too high can be as bad as setting the charge too low. Too low doesn't address the congestion problem. You still have people using it, but you're charging them money. And too high makes people use other facilities when the new facility goes underutilised. So setting the price right is important, and getting the appropriate price can be difficult. So if the price is set right, taxing the externality can make almost everyone better off. So you pay a congestion tax one way or the other, either in cash or in time wasted and frustration sitting in traffic. So if roads are untaxed, they'll tend to be overused. So you are paying through time. So taxing road users would reduce congestion. So for those who continue to drive at rush hour, the speedier trip is worth the fee. So people weigh up the costs and benefits. It's about internalizing the cost. If the road is free to use, you just use it whenever you want. But if there's a cost and the cost varies, if you need to drive at 5 o'clock and it costs a fiver to drive at 5 o'clock, you will drive at 5 o'clock if the benefits exceed the costs for you. But if you could delay your trip, go at 6:30 or make your trip earlier, the 5 o'clock or the €5 charge at 5 o'clock might say, look, I'll go at 4 o'clock instead. There's no great difference in it. So it spreads out the road usage over a longer period and reduces rush hour. So it can have useful effects.